I never thought the sound of a door closing would shatter my heart into 1,000 pieces. But there I was, standing on my own son's porch on Christmas Eve, watching him shut me out of the warmth I had helped build with my own hands. The snow was falling harder now, each flake a cold reminder of how far we'd fallen. My breath came out in white puffs as I stood there, gifts still clutched in my trembling hands, presents I'd saved up for months to buy. The Christmas lights twinkled mockingly through the window, casting colorful shadows on the snow at my feet. "Dad, there's just no room inside tonight," Michael had said, not even meeting my eyes. "Maybe you could wait out here for a bit? We're having some friends over, on Christmas Eve, and no room for the man who co-signed the mortgage on this very house." I could hear laughter echoing from inside, the warmth of voices that should have included mine. The irony wasn't lost on me. I was locked out of a home that still had my name on the paperwork, but Michael didn't know that yet. He'd forgotten so many things lately, but that detail was about to become very important. The wind picked up, cutting through my thin coat like a knife. I sat down on the cold concrete steps, still holding those unopened gifts, and felt something inside me begin to change. As I sat there in the bitter cold, my mind drifted back to a different December 15 years ago. Michael had just graduated college, and I remembered the pride in his eyes when we walked through this very house for the first time. "Dad, this is it," he'd whispered, running his hand along the kitchen counter. "This is where I want to build my life." I'd worked double shifts at the factory for months to help him with that down payment. 60-hour weeks, calloused hands, aching back. All worth it to see my boy's dreams come true. The bank officer had looked at Michael's fresh college income and shaken his head, but when I stepped forward to co-sign, everything changed. "With your father's backing, we can make this work," the loan officer had smiled. Michael had hugged me so tight that day, tears in his eyes. "Dad, I promise I'll make you proud. This house will always be yours too. Always be mine too." The words echoed in my memory as I watched the snow pile up on the porch railing. I remembered the housewarming party, how Michael had stood up in front of everyone and toasted me, to my dad who made all this possible, the man who never gave up on his son. The room had erupted in applause, and I'd felt like the richest man alive. Now that same son couldn't even let me inside on the coldest night of the year. The transformation was complete. Gratitude had withered into entitlement. Love had turned to indifference. But Michael had forgotten one crucial detail about that mortgage, and that forgetfulness was about to cost him everything. Mrs. Henderson from next door noticed me first. I watched her kitchen light flick on around 10 o'clock, and through her window I saw her pause, coffee mug halfway to her lips. She stared for a long moment before disappearing from view. 2 minutes later, her front door opened. "Harold, what are you doing out there?" Her voice carried across the yards, full of concern and disbelief. I forced a smile and waved. "Just getting some fresh air, Mrs. Henderson. Beautiful night, isn't it?" She wrapped her robe tighter and stepped onto her porch. "Honey, it's 20 degrees out there. Come inside and warm yourself up." "That's very kind, but I'm fine right here." The lie tasted bitter in my mouth, but I couldn't bear the pity in her eyes. "How do you explain that your own son has locked you out in the snow?" Through Michael's front window, I caught a glimpse of someone pulling the curtains closed. My daughter-in-law, Sarah, peeked out for just a moment before the fabric fell back into place. Even she couldn't look at what they'd done to me. More neighbors began to notice. The Johnsons' teenage son walked by walking his dog and did a double take when he saw me sitting there. Old Mr. Phillips from down the street slowed his evening shuffle to stare. Each curious glance felt like another weight on my chest. The snow kept falling and I kept sitting, my pride the only thing keeping me warm. Inside that house, my son was probably telling his friends some story about his difficult father, never mentioning how that difficult father had sacrificed everything to give him this life. But I had something Michael didn't know about, something that would change everything. Around midnight, as the neighborhood fell quiet, I pulled out my phone and scrolled through my old emails. There it was, the mortgage agreement from 15 years ago. My name clear as day right next to Michael's: joint ownership, joint responsibility, joint authority. When Michael was struggling to qualify for the loan, I hadn't just co-signed. I'd become a legal owner of the property, 51% to be exact. We'd structured it that way to satisfy the bank's requirements, with the understanding that once Michael established himself, we'd transfer full ownership to him, except we never did. The paperwork sat in my filing cabinet at home, forgotten by Michael but very much valid in the eyes of the law. All those years, while he lived his life and built his career, I'd stayed in the background, never asserting my legal rights because I trusted him, because I loved him. Sitting there in the snow, I realized that trust had been my biggest mistake. I thought about all the monthly mortgage statements that still came to my address, all the property tax notices I'd forwarded to Michael without a second thought, the homeowner's insurance policy that listed me as the primary contact. Michael had gotten so comfortable with his life that he'd forgotten the very foundation it was built on. My fingers were numb as I typed a text message to my lawyer, David Chen. We'd gone to school together decades ago, and he'd handled all my legal affairs ever since. David, I need to see you first thing Monday morning. It's about the Maple Street property. Time to collect on an old debt. The revenge wouldn't be hot and angry. It would be cold and calculated, just like the snow falling around me. At 3 in the morning, I finally stood up from those concrete steps. My legs were stiff, my fingers frozen, but my resolve had never been clearer. The Christmas gifts lay scattered around me where I'd dropped them, their bright wrapping paper already dusted with snow. I left them there, walking away from that house, the house I'd helped build, the house where my son slept warm and comfortable while I nearly froze. Felt like the longest journey of my life. Each step crunched in the fresh snow, marking my path toward a future I was just beginning to imagine. The motel down by the highway wasn't much, but it was warm, and the night clerk didn't ask questions when I walked in covered in snow at 3 a.m. The room smelled like industrial carpet cleaner and sadness, but the radiator worked, and that was enough. I sat on the edge of the bed and called my sister Margaret in California. She answered on the 4th ring, her voice thick with sleep. Harold, what's wrong? It's the middle of the night. Maggie, I said, and suddenly I couldn't hold back the tears anymore. The whole story came pouring out. Michael's coldness, the locked door, the snow, the humiliation. She listened without interrupting, the way she had when we were kids, and I'd come to her with my problems. That boy has forgotten where he came from, she said finally, her voice fierce with protective anger. What are you going to do? I stared out the motel window at the empty parking lot, watching the snow continue to fall. I'm going to remind him. The plan was already forming in my mind piece by piece. Michael thought he held all the cards, but he'd overlooked the most important one, and I was about to play it. Monday morning found me sitting in David Chen's office, the mortgage documents spread across his mahogany desk like evidence in a trial. David adjusted his reading glasses and looked up at me with something between surprise and admiration. Harold, I have to ask, did you know you still held majority ownership when you let him treat you that way? I knew, I said quietly. I just hoped I'd never have to use it. David leaned back in his leather chair, studying the papers again. Well, you certainly can use it. According to this agreement, you have the right to assume full control of the property if certain conditions are met. Non-payment of utilities, failure to maintain insurance, or... He paused, looking at me over his glasses. The cosigner determines that the property is being mismanaged. And locking the legal owner out in a snowstorm would constitute mismanagement? Oh, absolutely. David's smile was sharp. Harold, you don't just have the right to take action here. You have multiple legal avenues. The question is, how far do you want to take this? I thought about Michael's face as he closed that door on me. The casual cruelty of it, the complete lack of remorse or even acknowledgement that he'd done anything wrong. I want him to understand what he almost lost, I said. What he took for granted. David nodded and pulled out a fresh legal pad. Then let's discuss your options. First, we can initiate a formal review of the property management. That alone will get his attention. Second, we can invoke the ownership clause and assume direct control of mortgage payments. Third, he paused dramatically, we can begin proceedings to sell the property. Can we really do that? Harold, you own 51% of that house. Michael can't stop you from selling your share, and no one's going to buy half a house. It would force a complete sale. The power of it was intoxicating. After years of being taken for granted, dismissed, and finally locked out in the snow, I held the ultimate card. Let's start with the formal review, I decided. I want him to sweat a little first. While I was plotting in lawyers' offices, Michael was living his best life. I knew this because Mrs. Henderson called me. Apparently, my son had been bragging to the whole neighborhood about his newfound freedom. Harold, I hate to tell you this, she said, her voice tight with disapproval, but he's been telling everyone that he's finally cut the cord with you. Said you were too demanding, too needy. Yesterday I saw him loading new furniture into the house. Expensive-looking stuff. New furniture. While I'd been sitting in a motel, counting every dollar, Michael was redecorating. The irony was almost too perfect. And Sarah? I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to hear the answer. She seems uncomfortable with the whole thing, but she's not saying much. Though I did overhear her on the phone with her mother, saying something about how maybe they'd gone too far. At least someone in that house had a conscience. 2 weeks later, David called with an update that made my blood boil. Harold, I've been monitoring the property records. Your son missed last month's mortgage payment, and based on the utility records, he's running up quite a bill with that new hot tub he installed. A hot tub. He'd installed a hot tub while letting his father freeze on the porch. There's more, David continued. I did some checking with a friend at the bank. Michael applied for a home equity line of credit last week. Apparently, he wants to access his property's value for some investments. The audacity was breathtaking. He was planning to leverage a house he didn't fully own, probably assuming that since I'd been silent for 15 years, I'd stay silent forever. Michael had always underestimated me. Even as a child, he'd assumed that because I was quiet, I was weak. Because I was patient, I was passive. Because I loved him, I was powerless. He was about to learn how wrong he'd been on all 3 counts. The first domino fell on a Tuesday morning in January. I knew because David called me at exactly 9:47 a.m., and I could hear the satisfaction in his voice. The notice was delivered 20 minutes ago, he said. Property management review initiated by primary stakeholder. He'll have it in his hands by now. I imagined Michael opening that official envelope, probably expecting another piece of junk mail or a neighborhood association notice. Instead, he'd find legal letterhead and language that would make his blood run cold. Notice of Property Management Review. Joint ownership has been invoked due to concerns regarding property mismanagement and breach of co-ownership agreements. My phone rang 3 minutes later. Michael's number, of course. Dad? Dad, what the hell is this legal notice I just got? His voice was high, panicked. The arrogance was already cracking. Hello, Michael, I said calmly. I'm well, thank you for asking. How are you enjoying the hot tub? Silence. Then, how do you know about the... Dad, what is this notice? It says something about joint ownership and property review. That doesn't make sense, doesn't it? Maybe you should read it more carefully. I am reading it. It says you have majority ownership of my house. That's impossible. This is my house. I've been paying the mortgage for 15 years. You've been paying part of the mortgage, I corrected. I've been paying the property taxes and insurance this whole time. Did you think that money came from the mortgage fairy? Another silence, longer this time. I could almost hear the gears turning in his head, memory slowly returning. Dad, when we bought this place, you said it was just to help me qualify for the loan. I said a lot of things, Michael. I also said this house would always be mine too. Remember? At your housewarming party? Right before you toasted me as the man who made it all possible. His breathing got heavier. Dad, look, about Christmas Eve. Maybe we can talk about this. Maybe I was a little harsh. A little harsh. The words came out sharper than I intended. Michael, you left me sitting in the snow for 3 hours. Your neighbors were offering me blankets while you closed the curtains so you wouldn't have to look at me. I know, and I'm sorry, but nothing. You forgot something important, son. You forgot who holds the real power here. The next phase moved quickly. By the end of the week, David had filed the paperwork to assume direct control of all property decisions. Michael's home equity application was denied when the bank discovered the ownership dispute. His new credit cards, the ones he'd used to buy that hot tub and furniture, were suddenly demanding full payment. Michael called me every day, his tone shifting from angry to desperate to pleading. Dad, please, you're destroying my credit. Sarah's parents are asking questions. The neighbors are talking. Can't we work something out? We can, I said during one of those calls. I'm prepared to transfer full ownership to you today. Really? The relief in his voice was palpable. Absolutely. For fair market value, of course. David estimates the house is worth about $380,000 now. My 51% share comes to $193,800 cash only. The silence stretched so long I thought he'd hung up. Dad, you know I don't have that kind of money. Then I guess we'll have to sell. Sell? Dad, you can't be serious. This is my home. Sarah and I were planning to start a family here. Plans change, Michael. You taught me that on Christmas Eve. The papers were filed the following Monday. Intent to sell joint property. It sounded so official, so final. Within hours, Michael was at my apartment looking more disheveled than I'd ever seen him. "Dad, please. I'll do anything. I'll apologize to the whole neighborhood. I'll pay you back for Christmas Eve. I'll make sure you always have a place at our table." I looked at this man, my son, who I'd raised and loved and sacrificed for, and felt something break inside my chest. Not my resolve, but my heart, because despite everything, I still loved him. I just couldn't trust him anymore. "Michael," I said quietly, "do you understand what you did to me that night?" He nodded frantically. "I was stupid. I was thoughtless. You were cruel," I finished. "You looked at the man who gave you everything and decided he was worth nothing. You didn't just lock me out of your house, son. You locked me out of your heart." 6 months later, I was sitting in my new kitchen, watching Mrs. Chen from next door tend her garden through the window. Yes, David's mother-in-law had become my neighbor in the senior community I'd moved to after selling my share of Michael's house. The money from the sale had bought me this small but perfect place, with neighbors who invited me for coffee and treated me like family. I spent my evenings playing chess with retired teachers and sharing stories with veterans. For the first time in years, I felt valued. Michael had managed to keep the house, barely, by taking out a loan against his 401k and borrowing from Sarah's parents. The humiliation had been thorough and public, but he'd learned. He called me every Sunday now without fail. At first, the conversations were stilted, formal apologies mixed with tentative questions about my health. But slowly, something genuine began to emerge. Last week, he'd asked if I wanted to come for dinner. "Are you sure there's room?" I'd asked, and I could hear him wince through the phone. "Dad, there will always be room for you. I promise." I believed him mostly. Trust would take time to rebuild, but the foundation was there again. Sarah had called me separately to apologize, and I could hear the sincerity in her voice. They were expecting their first child in the spring, my first grandchild. The snow was falling again today, and I watched it through my warm kitchen window, safe and comfortable. Mrs. Chen knocked on my door around noon with homemade soup and stayed for lunch. We talked about her grandchildren and my upcoming visit to Michael's house. "You're a good man, Harold," she said as she was leaving. "Your son is learning that, but slowly." Michael had learned the hard way that love isn't weakness, generosity isn't foolishness, and family isn't disposable. Sometimes the gentlest people carry the sharpest swords. They just prefer not to use them. As I settled into my chair for my afternoon nap, I smiled at the irony. Michael had locked me out to make room for friends who forgot about him the moment things got difficult. But I'd found a whole community of people who welcomed me in from the cold. The real victory wasn't in the revenge. It was in discovering that I didn't need his house to have a home. I just needed people who understood that a man's worth isn't measured by his age or his bank account, but by the love he's given and the respect he's earned. And in the end, even Michael had learned that lesson too.